It's actually very interesting. So I haven't used it yet, but I read up on it a little bit, and I'm actually pretty intrigued, and I might play around with it. If anyone has used it, I'd be interested in hearing how you liked it. Node.js had a very major release, so 12.0. They upgraded to the latest version of V8, which gave a lot of nice benefits, including TLS 1.3, which is very fast, very secure transport layer for sending requests. You know, won't read all of those. Lots of really nice benefits if you're in that world. One thing to note, if you are still on Node 6, it is definitely time to upgrade, because along with that, Node 12 release, Node 6 went to end of life, so FYI. And the article that I linked to is specific to AWS Lambda functions. They're specifically talking about, I guess it's pretty common that people are using Node 6 with Lambda, and so they talk about sort of the security issues and things that they want you to upgrade for. Electron 5 is cool. So Electron, if you're not familiar with it, is basically being able to write desktop applications using kind of browser technologies like Node and JavaScript and so forth. So they had a 5.0 release. You know, a few features that are probably only interesting if you're using Electron. One thing that's of note is that there are breaking changes. So if you are using it, just be aware of that. And if you're not using it, but you're interested in that concept of building desktop apps using web technologies, major releases are always a good time to look at these and maybe play around with them. And then Babylon, this is a bit more of a specific thing. Probably not everyone would have a reason to use it. But if you're into graphics, if you're into building games, anything like that, this is a really great library. And they just had a major release, 4.0. And I will let this little cool demo speak for itself. So I loaded it before. Hopefully it'll be fast. The first time you load it, it has to load a bunch of model data and stuff so that it can render. Well, I guess I should have preloaded the tab. Let's see. We'll give it a second. But basically, this is all browser JavaScript. So uses WebGL, uses all kinds of fancy shaders and rendering kind of stuff, animation. So this is all in the browser. Pretty nifty. So if you're interested in building something like that, check out Babylon. And now, of course, I lost my tab. I don't know why Chrome decided to change the tab behavior there. There we go. Cool, so Babylon. Also .NET, does anyone use .NET? A few people. I used to use it in a former life. I haven't used it real recently, but it's actually pretty cool. Like, one of the big trends we talk about here at the meetup is Microsoft. You know, back in the 70s, it was this trend-setting, amazing company, and then it went through this period of being the most evil company in the world and got slightly broken up, and you know, all the drama that they've gone through over the years. But really, in the past 4 or 5 years, they've really adopted open source. They acquired GitHub last year, and they've really gone after being open and really trying to develop the developer ecosystem. So this is pretty cool. So they're iterating their platform, calling it .NET 5. And so the basic idea is you have this core layer that does all the basic infrastructure plumbing type stuff. And then you layer language-specific build targets on top of that. So the idea is you write a core sort of foundation of code, and then you can target everything from Linux to Android to tvOS and a lot more. So that's pretty cool, actually. So if you're into cross-platform type of development, it might be a good time. This is not out yet, actually. This was just announced, so they're still working on it. But it would be a good thing to keep an eye on if you're in that world. So some tips and tricks. Actually, one main one main trick, I don't know. Designing for dark mode. So if you're on a Mac, you probably are familiar with dark mode. It's a new OS level theme, basically, that comes with Mojave. And I have it on my computer. You see the bar here is dark. It's hard to see up there, but so yeah, it's a operating system level theme. And the cool thing is you can actually start to leverage that in the browser as well. So I linked to a great overview that goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to. But you can basically, using this new media query, which is very simple. If you're familiar with media queries, it's just a way that allows you to target different CSS styles based on some aspect of the browser. The most common thing you'll see is based on width breakpoints for responsive design. But in this case, you can target the color scheme. So basically, this tells you that if the operating system is light, dark, or no preference, then you can style accordingly based on that. And it's CSS, so at that level, inside those braces, you have full control to style whatever you have access to in your application, which is pretty neat. It's actually already supported today out of the box in Safari, and it's slated for the next versions of both Chrome and Firefox. So yeah, it's actually going to be pretty usable pretty soon. So if you're interested, check that out. And there's also a React specific tutorial that I linked to as well, since we're talking about React. Security. So how many people saw this? Docker Hub got hacked a few weeks ago. How many people use Docker Hub? A fair number. So the good thing is you probably would know about it because they emailed the people who were affected. So if you did not get an email, you're probably okay. But 190,000 accounts were accessed, and actually the data that was leaked was pretty sensitive. It was usernames, passwords, they're hashed. But as always, the reminder is if you have a password that you use on multiple services, even if it's hashed, that's still bad news for you potentially. And they also leaked source repo tokens, so like GitHub private tokens and things like that. Pretty bad. So again, if you haven't heard from them, you're probably fine, but just don't reuse passwords, please. Just our periodic reminder about that. I'm not sure. You can follow that link to find out the details. I didn't read that closely. So in case you missed it, this is an annual handbook that this guy has come up with for the past 4 years or so. It's actually pretty good. It's very detailed, so I would say, unless you have a bunch of free time on your hands, you probably won't read through the whole thing from start to finish. But I linked to chapter 0, which is a nice sort of recap of the trends that he saw over the past year and sort of previewing the trends that are looking good going into 2019. So even if you don't have time to go through the whole thing, that's a pretty short sort of TLDR version that I would recommend everyone check out. And then this was a little minor headline, but it was actually pretty interesting. So Googlebot has finally, after all these years, gone evergreen. So Googlebot was actually sort of its own custom little, browser implementation. It was probably some old version of Chrome, I imagine. But they've actually switched it over to track Chromium, just like the normal desktop browser, which is pretty cool. So Googlebot itself now understands ES6 syntax natively. It understands web components. It understands intersection observer, which is kind of a cool newer standard. So basically what that means is that you can lazy load images based on whether or not they're actually intersected by the frame that's visible by the user, and a lot of other stuff. So that's pretty cool. And then this just came out a few days ago, I believe, but GitHub actually entered the package registry sort of arena, which is interesting. So this should be pretty useful for people that haven't wanted to get into like hosting their own sort of NPM type projects themselves. So you'll be able to actually publish private packages that you can install and use kind of within your own sort of private repos, which is pretty cool. It offers the features you would expect from something like that: global CDN, authentication, permissions managed kind of along with all your repos. It currently supports the package management systems listed there. It does not support PyPy, which is kind of interesting and a bit of a bummer since I use Python, but I'm assuming that'll probably be coming soon. And it's actually in beta. I tried signing up for it, and there's already a wait list, but check it out if you're interested. And then on the lighter side, scary clown, there's this project that I ran across JavaScript and web audio based guitar pedal board. So that's pretty cool. This is just a little thing that a guy wrote as a personal project. The reason I found it especially interesting is the overview is a pretty detailed kind of description with code of like how he implemented all the different effects. So this is like code for how he implemented reverb using web audio. So that's the interesting part of it. You can watch the video to see it in action. But I thought that was a fun little project. And then React 95, how many people saw that? Since we're React people, I thought I would end on a high note. So someone with way too much time on their hands apparently has implemented the Windows 95 desktop theme essentially in React components. And this is not just a visual thing, this is a legitimate, these are legit components. So if you go to the Storybook, by the way, how many people use Storybook? It's pretty awesome. If you don't use it and you build React components, you should check it out. Obviously it doesn't scale well to that, but so you can basically, the cool thing about Storybook, if you're not familiar with it, is it gives you a way to display and test components in isolation. So instead of like having to build a whole app to be able to get to that one custom button that you want to play around with, you can just load it up into here, use it in isolation. These are actually fully dynamic little components. But yeah, you can see here, you know, Windows style components. And then if you look at the code, like I said, sorry, this thing doesn't seem to want to zoom very well. I'll have to file a bug with Storybook on that. But I know it's hard to see, but you can trust me. These are basically, when you look at the code, they're very much standard React components, standard state, standard kind of change handlers and things like that. So it's funny because it's Windows 95, but it's actually legit components. So like you might actually check them out, see if you learn anything from them. But I thought that was pretty cool. And I think that's my last slide. Let me make sure. Yeah, that's it for me. So thanks for your time. And Corey's up next with his little condo remodel. Yeah, thanks.
All right, so how many of you have ever done a renovation? Anyone? Couple. Okay, so I've recently undergone, obviously, remodeling a condo here. It was supposed to be a 3-month project. Took 18. So I'm going to walk you through just a kind of a quick overview of the experience and how code came into play. And so really, I have one major tip here. Don't do this at home. Don't try it at all. It is a miserable experience. It's very different than remodeling a house. And really, that's about it. So thank you. But no, in all seriousness, how does coding come into play in a renovation? And what I found interesting about this whole effort was that for once, you know, as a developer, you're usually finding a way to produce virtual products. Well, for once, there was something physical that I was able to do with this. And the big question is, how does that actually apply? And it's really to planning. So here we go. So just for some context here, based on, I called it my winometer, I was able to determine that tiling was the job that sucked the most. I couldn't stand it, and this picture here, you can see how much tile there was in this condo. That's there's a backsplash of tile, there's a floor of tile, there's a horrible little bar there that stuck out over, you couldn't get past the hallway there with tile that was impossible to clean. And this place was, straight out of 1970. Now, if anybody lives in a place like this, I apologize, but I couldn't stand it. This is what the results were of it, and in particular with tiling, the reason I'm you can kind of see here now, this particular photo, the reason I'm pointing this out is if you look in the shadow, you'll be able to see where the actual tile grout lines are. And so with all of that said, how does that work into planning? Well, that whole visual that you just saw there, it was, and I'm going to scroll back to this for a second. These two walls here, all tile, large format tile. And it is a hell of a lot harder than it looks. You know, you think, okay, I just stick a grid of tile up on the wall and good to go, but it's not like that at all. As you can see in this particular photo, this is that same wall. This was the first time I tried to tile it. And the issue here is that I was off by a 1/16 of an inch on a grout line that was, you weren't able to see it because the cabinets were blocking it. So I didn't notice until I got to the second last row that there was a gap in the tile that was as big as my thumb. So it looked terrible, and I ended up having to tear a lot of stuff out and redo it, and that sucked. And unfortunately, that wasn't the first time I had to redo things. I also had to redo a bathroom floor, and I had to redo a bathroom shower wall. So by the time on my third failure, I'm just like, this is terrible. There's got to be a better way. And I realized that my issue was that I was doing most of the planning on paper. I was drawing things out on grid or on graph paper, and just trying to figure out, the right size, right measurements, all that kind of stuff. So naturally, as a developer, what do? I turn to code instead. So I'm going to show an example here of what actually happened. So this is a code pen, and this will all be linked at the end of the presentation. But so this is a grid, and because it's all white, it might be a little bit difficult to tell. But I started with a Flexbox based CSS layout. You can see the black border here is kind of the wall, or it represents the whole wall. And these white spots here, so this bottom part here is base cabinets. You got a countertop in here, you got some upper cabinets, a door on the side, and the little black thing here is an outlet. And that was valuable because I was able to quickly see what this layout looked like, and I'm of course using CSS, but then I was able to overlay the tile pattern that you see in the background, and that on its own doesn't sound all that exciting until you start thinking about how do I actually make this look good, because when you're putting tile up on a wall, it's expensive stuff, you don't want to burn through it. And there are a couple of rules that help your product look good at the end, and one of those is that you want to center tile. So in this case, you can see, hopefully you can see these red lines here in the center, and they come directly to a center point on the wall. Now in this particular design, that was the most effective way of doing it, but there is an alternative pattern, which is to try to center on a grout line. And I'm going to show you the difference here. So the code, I'm not sure if I can, somewhere in here, where is it? There it is, okay. So this is just a little hack. But when I do that, and it's very subtle, but the little red line shifted a little bit, and you can see it doesn't actually line up. Now, the reason that was important in my situation was because I didn't have enough tile to do the job if I were to align it on a grout line. So the first time that I sat down and did this with graph paper, I was just going back and forth trying to make sure, every detail, like do I have it down to the 32nd of an inch, do I have it right? And that was really grueling, honestly, when I had 7 of these jobs to do overall. So the point that I'm trying to make is that by setting this all up in code, I was able to toggle very quickly and say, okay, does this design make sense? Am I going to be wasting money or not? And it worked out really, really well in the end, because every job that I did after this, I got done perfectly, dead on, first try for each one. And that was all just because I was able to sit here and play around with things a little bit. And you may notice, I mean, this code is just basic CSS. There's really not that much to it. I'm going to get rid of that comment that out here. Question? I wanted to use Flexbox because I wasn't sure what size tile I'd be using, so I was able to create constraints that would expand or collapse to whatever size tile I wanted. And it's a perfect segue into the fact that I was using CSS Variables for this. So like, in particular towards your question, I was able to identify tile height, tile width. Now, could I have done that with a grid? Yes, I'm just personally more comfortable with Flexbox. I've been using that for so long that it made sense to me. I mean, you could certainly do this with CSS Grid if you wanted to. But in this particular case, it was useful because I was able to change my layout. I was able to go from this large kitchen wall to a small little vanity wall, to a kitchen shower wall, you know, and it was just simple. It was the same concept over and over. So I was able to really not repeat myself, but at the same time be able to focus on different projects. And so that's where these CSS variables come into play, because when you're doing this with someone else, it's important to see what this stuff kind of looks like. So we were able to mock things up just by doing a simple color change. I'll just do black to make it really apparent here. So like black grout would look terrible in this particular design, but again, the point is rapid visualization and rapid changes, and being able to do adjustments very quickly. So I think that was most of what oh, right. The other part of this that was very useful is the fact that I was able to keep a progress meter of sorts. So down here you can see, I just kind of made this up since the job is done, but there's 16 installed and 31 uninstalled. Well, going to that one particular tile that was a real pain, this guy right here, once that was installed, I just have a simple list of JavaScript, or it's in JavaScript, it's just an array that has each tile number on it. And the beauty of all this was it's all done with CSS, so I'm using the counter reset to count out which tile is which. So when you're actually sitting there doing the work, you can write 1, 2, 3 on each tile, and then when they're done, or once they're actually up on the wall, that one was 20. Now it's installed, and that's valuable because if you've ever had to do this job, sometimes these large format tiles like what we used, if you have to work with a bowed wall or something that doesn't, it's not just like a straight, hey, I'm going to stick it on and go. Sometimes you have to do it across multiple days because you have to let stuff set. Otherwise, the weight of the tile above it will start to push down and shift things, and it looks really, really bad. So anyhow, it gave me a progress meter and kind of a way to keep everything in check and what I was doing. And then the other valuable part of this was, let's see, what is it? Sorry, I know this is there's a lot on the screen here, but the JavaScript here, there's not too much of it. But one important feature was being able to go through this code and identify every tile and the specific size that it was supposed to be. And that's a really, really important thing if you're trying to cut something down, like, again, if you have this large format tile, which if you're unfamiliar with that, that's basically 12 inches tall by 24 inches wide. And if you cut that wrong, you're pretty much wasting a whole tile, and they're not cheap. So it's, again, cost savings to make sure that you get it done right the first time. And so I was able to go through and just spit out a simple log here. You can see all the different sizes by tile, and that was just calculated by JavaScript. Really simplistic stuff overall. There's, I think, a grand total of 54 lines of JavaScript code here, and that little report is only a couple of lines. Yeah, like 10 lines of code roughly. So it ended up being very useful because it's kind of guerrilla, it's kind of a hack, right? There's nothing, this is not an app, it was just something that I sat down and coded out quickly, and it saved me hours, probably days, maybe even weeks of time. And I'm really, really grateful I did it. If I were to do it again, the one major change that I would make is that I used a 10 pixel scale, so 10 pixels per inch. That was a mistake. The reason being that an American tape measure has it's broken up into 1/16 of an inch. So if I were to go back and do this again, I would use 16 pixels per inch instead of 10. And the reason being, you can see here, hopefully you can see in my variables for tile height and tile width, I had 117.5 tall and 237.5 wide, which translates to roughly 11 3/4 inches tall and 23 3/4 inches tall or wide, which is the actual size of a tile. That doesn't break down very well because if you can, and hopefully, I'm not sure if I can make this bigger, but you'll see like it rounds incorrectly. So like 11.7 inches or 11.8 inches when it's actually 11.75. So that choice in scale was not the best, and so that's what I would do if I had to go and do this all over again. Yeah, question?
What about centimeters? Could you have used centimeters?
Probably could have. I didn't, simply because the tile and everything else was done with English or like with standard inches and stuff like that. But there's no reason you couldn't do it with centimeters or the metric system. Honestly, though, that's the reason that I created this, because the first question that came to my mind was, why not just use an existing piece of software? And there is like nothing good out there. And the only stuff that is out there, it's all Flash-based, and everything is in the metric system. Yet all of the tiles are in English format. So it's like, you could do the conversions, if you wanted to, but at the end of the day, I was like, it's simpler to make something on my own than to try to go and use one of these online tools that just doesn't work. And the alternative is software. So like if you watch HDTV and you see these like fancy remodels where they show you all the 3D design and everything, well, that's design. That doesn't give you measurements. That doesn't give you what you need. You're going to need different software like Chief Architect or Pro Chief Architect or something. It's $1,600 set of software. It's like, I'm not paying, a remodel is already expensive enough. I'm not going to go out and spend another $1,600 on software I'm going to use once, especially when an hour-long hack was able to get me the results that I needed. So that said, what is it? Control F or I forget. Okay, that was it. So to kind of conclude this, there were 56 lines of JavaScript, 197 lines of CSS, 90 lines of HTML, and that's obviously not that much. And the result or the return of that was rapid and dynamic visualizations. As you saw, I was able to adjust things and see things in before I went and actually put it up on the wall. I got my reporting out of it, progress tracking, and most importantly, I got a lot more confidence than having gone in and just done it on paper. Because frankly, I'm more comfortable in code than I am on paper. And then, of course, the major benefit is that it was free. And that really, if you want to hear more about this, I wrote an article about it. It's on Medium, linked here. And then all the code pens, not just the one that I showed here tonight, are up on CodePen. You can get to it on a collection that I created there. And that, for real, is all I've got here tonight. So thank you. You all done with this? Yeah.
Is there a connection?
Oh, yeah, you're
HDMI. Thanks. All right. Let me just change this a little bit. So, progressive web apps, and you guys may be familiar with it.
You might use
Oh,
the
yeah.
mic just in case people are on the live stream.
Okay. So I was telling my wife about progressive web app, and she's not a coder, and she says, "Well, that sounds political." So that reminds me of two of my friends, whose names are Rob and Dennis, and they grew up together in a small town, but one is conservative, the other's liberal. And sometimes we barbecue together, and they tease each other mercilessly with political jokes. So I would like to share a couple of them. So the first one is that Rob, Rob being the conservative, he teases Dennis. He says, "Who's the first liberal Democrat?" And Dennis shrugs his shoulder and says, "I don't know." So he says, "Well, Christopher Columbus, because he left his country not knowing where he was going, and then he got to a place not knowing where he was, and then he left again not knowing where he had been, and he did it all on borrowed money." So of course, Dennis, he's not shy either. He has an immediate, quick comeback. He says, what do you get when you mix a conservative and a pig? And Rob says, I don't know. And Dennis says, absolutely nothing. There are certain things pigs wouldn't do. Well, anyway, but our great nation's a little divided. I'm joking here, but there's hope, though. I don't know if you guys saw this news. Again, my wife was telling me this news. I try to stay away from the news. It's a little depressing. And the guy his name is Zach Mayo, and the girl's name is Lucy Rogers. And they were running competing for a Senate seat in Vermont. And he's a Republican guy, and she's from a Democratic Party. And they've been running, against each other, and they never, make the other person look bad. And in the end, they had a public debate in this library. And they agreed ahead of time that at the end they will play music together. Check out that link, and Corey, I think he's going to share the slide. But it's a really cool story. So they answered people's questions on how they're going to solve the problems. And in the end, they played the music together, so the debate ended in harmony. So there is hope. But yeah, check this out. It's a really cool story. But wouldn't it be cool if we can combine the best of both candidates, right? But the thing is, in reality, that's almost impossible. But in the digital world, though, it's possible, right? That's why the progressive web app comes in, right? We have native apps and web apps. And you're either implementing native apps or web apps. And when I say native apps and web apps, that's based on where the code is installed. Native apps, as you know, it's installed on your individual devices. Or web apps, so obviously it's installed on the website and accessed via the browser, right? And each has its own pros and cons. I'm not going to list all of them. I list some of them, right? So native app, the advantage is that you can run the app without a connection. It's connection independent. And it can engage the users with push notifications, right? And most of the time it feels faster. But the thing is, it is woefully out of date, because especially these days we're pushing continuous delivery, right? And if, I don't know about you, I'm not constantly going to go update, even though I get notification on my app, I'm not going to update the code. So it's frequently out of date, and that's really not good news for developers, right? We want to make sure they have the newest features. And a lot of times it's device dependent, even though we have cool tools to kind of mitigate that, right? We have, Xamarin, and you can develop using React Native and things like that. But you still have to do some things to appease the device itself. And if the content is not URL based, it's not easily shareable. And also the app is not easily discoverable, right? And web apps, on the other hand, has its own advantages, right? Pros and cons. And it's always up to date. Whenever you push an update, the user gets it the next time when they access it. And it's device dependent because you have the browser helping you with that. And of course, the content can be shared with a URL, right? You found something on Amazon, send it to your friend, your family, hey, check this out. But that's not easily done on native apps. And unfortunately, it is connection dependent, right? Without internet connection, it's not easy to get the content there. And it is, as you know, there's no push notifications as we know today, not easily anyway. And a lot of times it feels slower, primarily because of the connection issue. And so, like I said earlier, wouldn't it be nice if we can combine the best of both worlds? And that's exactly where progressive web app comes in. The term progressive, I think I mentioned it in the intro if you guys have read it. It's, it should work for everybody, right? When I say everybody, we're talking about globally. And we here in the developed countries, we have the advantage of faster connections, more reliable connections, faster devices. But not so in many parts of the world, right? So your app needs to be able to work without a connection, be able to work on a slower connection. So that's one of the things that the progressive web apps tries to achieve. And the other part is that it needs to be responsive, right? If you're going to say, I'm going to take the best of the both worlds, and that's where native apps really shine. It is designed for that device, so it fits very nicely. And progressive web app needs to do that. And again, like I mentioned, one of the weaknesses in the web app is the connection dependency. And if it is connectivity wise, if it's independent, obviously that's better. And also it needs to feel like an app, right? You don't have to always punch in your URI, and then you're not really combining the best experience. And again, installable kind of goes with the app-like. But the difference is that you don't have to deal with app stores. You don't need to go to the app store and install it. You should be able to install by the virtue of accessing the web app. And continued and frequently refreshed. Remember we talked about native apps being constantly out of date. And there's a strategy that you can update the app in the background. And we'll talk about the service worker that's in the background that can make that happen. And it's safety obviously it's on everybody's mind. So HTTPS is a requirement. It will not work if it's not HTTPS, with the exception for localhost. Obviously that's for development. You don't have to use HTTPS. And discoverable. So there's if you go read online, there's a whole RFC out there for app discoverability, and there's something called manifest JSON file in there that describes what the app is. And re-engageable, right? Traditional web apps, we cannot have push notifications, and progressive web app, on the other hand, should. And the linkable, again, one advantage of the web app, you should be able to send a link to somebody to be able to load in their copy of the progressive web app. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit of I mentioned the service worker, and the service worker has its own life cycle. So what is service worker? Service worker, nothing but a web worker that runs in a separate thread from the browser's UI thread. So it is the service worker. Once you have a service worker registered, your browser will start directing, will give the service worker an opportunity to intercept your communication with the server. That's how it achieves the offline access, right? So let's say you access URL abc dot blah blah blah, and if you're offline, if you're not on the internet, and the service worker can access, first of all, when we talk about installation, we're actually caching what they call app show within the context of progressive web app, and even data and the assets, right? So when you access it, you should still be able to load it. So service worker does that. So in order for the service worker to work, you have to register that service worker. And the service worker is really just a JavaScript file. But you have to tell the browser, hey, this is a service worker. And so then once you do that, the registration process really is the installation process. And then once you have installed it, it goes through the activation process. Why is that important? When you're installing it for the first time, installed, activated right away. But imagine you have installed one version, the next version comes, right? Then when the next version is installed, there's a setting called skip waiting. If you don't set that to true, what it will do is that it will let the older version of the service worker to finish its work. So if you close the tab or close the browser, reopen it, then the second one will be activated. Otherwise, it will stay in the awaiting mode unless you go to the browser, debugging tools. There's another way to say, hey, skip waiting and then let it activate it as well. But obviously, that's not how most of the users use it. And I talked about the waiting, and you can, of course, unregister once you have registered. So I talked about how service worker is able to intercept the request. So that's how it is able to respond to the page request, right? So there are different strategies that you can use depending on your business requirement. So network first, if you think of a scenario, why would I want to make a request on network first? Imagine if you're trying to access a stock price. Obviously, you want to have the most up-to-date value, right? But if you don't have the network, it is better to give back the respond with the data that's cached. Now, I'm showing something called cache and IndexedDB. So cache is the cache storage, and I am not talking about the local storage that you may have heard in browsers. And it is not recommended to use local storage for that purpose. There's a cache API that's built into the browser that you can use in the service worker for that purpose. And so it is recommended that you store optional, your assets, your JavaScript, etc., in the cache storage. But if you have data storage that you may be storing on the server, in the case of stock price, you store that in the IndexedDB for that purpose. So network first says, okay, I want to see if the network comes back with a response. If either there's no connection, or if it takes too long, I'm going to respond back with the value from the my local cached data, right? And the other strategy is that cache first says, oh, this content is not that urgent for me to know. I'm gonna see if it's in the cache first. If it is, I will give it to that user, right? If it is not, I'm gonna go to the network, go get it, and respond to the page. Also, at the same time, update my local cache. And the third strategy is stale well validated. Basically, in that case, I'm going to access the cache. At the same time, I'm also going to make a network request. And if I find it in the cache, great, I respond with it. But in the meantime, I have updated my cache. So next time when I load it, it's up to date. And so there are, let me just go back. There are a couple other strategies. It's going nuts somehow. Race, basically you fire a request, cache and network at the same time. In that case, you would think cache would come back sooner. Not necessarily the case. Not always the case, because if you have so many tabs open, if the browser's busy, in that case the network might come back first. It's doing its thing here. I don't know why it's doing that. And there's another option you can do, background sync. There again, it's in the service worker, but for that you have to obtain the user's permission. So now show me the code. So let me try to get out of there, and I think I will go into a duplicate display mode here. So. All right. So to give you a little bit of a background on the code, so Brian earlier mentioned you don't have to be an expert to present, right? I'm really sharing my learning experience here. I was learning progressive web app, and I thought, hey, what better than React framework or the library for Upshield than anything else, because it's so component based. It's a great modular design tool. And the other piece is on the back end, I'm using .NET, let me just close this, .NET Core for API, right? So my app is super simple, and I can show you a little bit. So I just created a something called a jargon dictionary. If all of you, doesn't matter what domain you work in, we always have these acronyms, right? So I thought, hey, that'd be a great way to try out IndexedDB, try out caching, etc. So I kind of created this, and that's Benjamin on the webband. That's his short name. But anyway, so to show you a little bit of the app here, so I can go into the search, right? And this is just my local development. Oh, another thing that I forgot to mention, I talked about progressive web app supports push notifications. It will also support payment now. And I'm not sure if all the browsers have developed it or not, but there are some great app examples out there that I can show you. So in this case, it's pretty simple. So let me show you. If I go into the my tool here, I think I'll go like this. Step number one, we talked about that your app needs to be responsive, right? It should fit all kinds of devices, and Chrome obviously has this kind of nice tool. You can, depending on what your device is, you should be able to make it responsive, right? The other things that you may have noticed here, the different images were downloaded because I changed the device, right? And that's something that Brian mentioned earlier, the media query. For different media, you use a different query to make sure you use the right size of image, so it will be a better experience. So earlier I talked about in the service worker using various cache strategies, right? Network versus cache first. And for that purpose, you can obviously write your own too, but I am using something workbox. So I'm gonna show you what the service worker looks like. So I created this little React app using Create React. And so Create React actually creates this little file called service worker. It really didn't have anything, right? But you can make changes in this. So this is actually not the service worker itself. It's more of the registration tool. So the first thing, can you guys see okay? On the line 26, you have to see if your browser supports service worker or not, right? If your browser supports and if your page has loaded, and then make sure you check for the valid service worker. And then if you go further down, you will actually see my registration code. Let's see, where is it? There it is. Okay, so do you see this URL? This actually points to the actual service worker file I have here. So it says, hey, this is my service worker JavaScript registered, and it returns a promise. And once it is registered, then you can do a bunch of stuff, right? You can check to see if it's installed or not. So again, I'm using passing in an object so I can intercept. Basically, it's a callback, right? So this is being called from your React typical index and JS. As you can see here, I'm registering here. I'm just logging in this case. And for the index DB, I'm using a library called Dixie.js, and it is a super awesome library. I created a, I mentioned in the intro that I would like to share some good practices. And, even on the front end, you can implement repository pattern. So separation of concerns, I have database, right? I have my database implementation here. If you're familiar with it, with Dixie.js, you will know. But regardless what tools you use, you can version the database, right? And Dixie.js is based on using the browser's built-in IndexedDB API in there, right? So you see different version numbers, and I can define a store. Store is pretty much equivalent to a table in the traditional database. Obviously, this is not a table-based structure. It's more of a key value pair type of structure. So if you see here, I have defined a table or store called jargon items, in which I have ID and the term. Now, these two are just indexes. Okay, ID is the primary key, and I have a term. Term is the acronym, right? And I have an ampersand in the front that just simply says this is an index. And again, it uses this convention. It's pretty cool. Then I have another store for settings, right? And in this case, I'm using the ++ in the front. And in this case, I'm letting the browser index it. For the jargon ID, I'm using the database to generate the ID, so I didn't want the front end, right? So once you have that, you can create various repository, right? And then this in turn is using that DB to read the data. And if you're not familiar with it, it comes with this super cool Fluent interface, right? So one thing about using the workbox. So let's look at the service worker file, right? So this is my service worker, and I mentioned earlier I'm using workbox, and so in the service worker we don't use script tag. You use this import script built-in function, and for workbox you can configure what you're going to pre-cache. When I say pre-cache, we talked about caching the op shell, right? But I have left this array empty. You know why? Because as you know, React, when you go through the building process, React generates its own, file names with these crazy numbers, right? So how do you do that? How do you automate that process so it will pre-cache your stuff? And so I will come back to this file later, but for now, so one solution I found, you may have better solutions, but one solution that I found is that a worker box actually comes with a kind of cool GOP plugin. It's called workbox-build. And so what you can do is that you can say, hey, here's my source worker file, and now here is the patterns, right, that I want to use to cache my files. And I created a couple of them. One is for the local dev, the other is for production, right? Again, obviously this can be improved. So when I have these two different tasks, and you can just add it to the package.json, and whenever I'm going to run it for local development, I'm adding this. So once I have done that, what happens is that it takes my service worker and it will generate my pre-cached collection of files. It's collapsed here. And as you can see, not only did it populate my array here with the files, and it's got a revision numbers. So if your files ever change, even by a byte, it will update this, and for obvious reasons. And that's when we talked about in progressive web apps, we keep the app locally installed and up to date, right? And so whenever it sees this different revision, the service worker can say, hey, you need to re-update, and it will go through that process. This new service worker will get activated, and it will get a fresh set of cache, right? So let's look at the browser side, see what it looks like. So if I come over here, you can see here, I talked about skip waiting, and in the code you can actually say skip waiting. I didn't, so therefore I have a new service worker, but it's still waiting there, right? Here's the old service worker, and earlier I talked about the discoverability, and that's this manifest JSON file, right? That defines what your app is, and I'll show you why that's important later. But for now, if I say skip waiting, now the new version has taken place, right? So over here, what I'm going to show you what the worker box does. So the worker box, once the service worker runs, it pre-caches my stuff, right? So if you look at this, it's got all of these, right? And if you look at this static, this blah, 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 that's all React generated, CSS, JavaScript, blah, blah, blah. But if you're going to do that manually, not very easily done, right? So that's on the caching side. So on the index DB side, you saw my database is named JargonDB. And you can see, here's my store, right? And this is my regular list of data. And obviously, this is the primary key. And here's the index that I defined, right? And this is just a settings table. You can keep settings in here. And so you have a complete app basically installed locally in the browser. If I go in here, I have a little connection indicator here. So if I go here, if I go offline, and let's look at the console. Right? Actually, let's look at the setting first. I said network first, right? There's a little issue here, but I'm still offline, as you can see. So if I go here, let me just do this. Okay.
Do that at the network level. Under the network tab.
Network.
Offline.
Okay. Yeah, this is the same thing basically. Okay. Yeah, it's the same thing. It will still put you offline. On the navigator, .online would be false. Either way, it's the same. So what I have done, as you saw, it's network first, right? And if you look at my index DB, I have these terms defined in here. So if I go, now that I'm offline, I have console here. And again, this app is a work in progress. So let's say if I type the letter B, right? And it found it. And so it says offline, searching the DB, right? And so now if I put it back online, because I said it's network first, okay, I'm gonna go online here. Now I'm gonna come back over here. If I, let's say, put in A, right? And this was the previous one. So this, starting from here, I'm online, network first, and these are just my logs, right? And from the network, I got a response for my value, right? And so just different strategies here. Okay, so let's go back to the service worker again. I'm just gonna collapse this. And earlier I mentioned, service worker will fire these events, install, right? Activate. And here's another one. We talked about push notification, right? So the push notification, if you have step number one, let me just step back a little bit. In order for the push notification to work, as you know, it's easily done in the native app, right? A native app, because you are aware of your device. On the other hand, for the browser to know where to send the, for the server to know to which app, progressive web app, to send the notification to know, it needs to identify it. So what you have to do is that you have to go through this subscription process. Now, browser has this built-in subscription, push notification subscription process. It's called the push API. Unfortunately, right now, the browser dictates what push service you use. Hopefully that will change. So I will show you what the push service stuff looks like. Let me just see. So when you subscribe to push service, if you do it in Chrome, it's going to send you this end code. And Google's more generous. There's no expiration time here. And it also gives you this P256DH. If you guys have been here to my symmetric and asymmetric talk, DH stands for Diffie-Hellman key exchange. It's similar to RSA. So it's really for exchanging the information. So obviously you realize when you're sending push notification, depending on third-party push service, you don't want that information to be exposed, right? And one of the reasons why we have HTTPS, so this will encrypt the data. And the second one is if you register through Chrome, from Firefox, this is what you get. And I got this from the old Edge, not the Chromium-based. In the Chromium-based, literally, I'm getting an error. It wouldn't register. So if you go look at my code here, or let's just go look at my app. If I go into the service, so another good practice here, whenever you request for, you may have seen this when you access certain website, says, hey, allow notification, right? And a lot of times you don't know, why is it asking me to send notification? So there's something called a value proposition. So in other words, you only want to show that when it makes sense to the user, right? If you pop that up randomly or on the first page load, people don't know what it is. And people are very privacy conscious these days and they don't want to be spammed. They will say no. If they say no, it is very hard to get back unless you go into the settings, which most users don't know how to do that. So value proposition is that when it makes sense. So in this case, let's say, the user adds a new vocabulary, right? Then I pop up a message that says, hey, would you like to receive a notification if another person adds an acronym? And in this case, the user might say yes. And if the user says yes, then pop up that notification. If the user says no, don't show the browser option. And it will remain in the default mode, right? So that's the value proposition. And I'm sure that same concept is applicable in other places. So whenever you click on that push notification, and as you can see over here, I got this push subscription from Google again, right? So the idea is that you are supposed to store this on the server side, okay, on your server. And so once you do that, so if I'll show you my little API, and again, this is web API. You can implement this API with using anything, right? Python, like Brian's shop, or Java. So I got this API here, and if I can save it to the database, and the subscription is stored here, right? Oh, my SQL is just loading. But once you have stored that on the server side, so over here, what I'm doing, another good practice, separation of concerns. You don't want to send a notification from your from your API when you're saving the data, right? Instead, you publish a message and utilize message bus, publish this message to throw it on the bus and say, hey, I saved a new term. And then you can implement a handler for that and say, hey, somebody just saved a new message. Then you can decide to push notifications to the users or not. So in my case, I'm just simply publishing a message here, say, hey, send push notifications, right? So let me demonstrate that here. So if I go here, save a new jargon, I don't know, just some random stuff, right? And then I will submit this. So you saw this, right? New jargon item got saved. And if you look at this, I have a notification here. I got a bunch of them because I have saved this many times. You will see a collection of push notification for the same browser. And this whole look and feel can be customized too. On the end, earlier mentioned in the service worker, so basically it came down here, right? It received your app because you registered this particular browser. It receives this notification. And once you have received the notification, you can customize the look and feel of that notification. So interestingly, Chrome will actually use Windows notification experience, pop it out here. And if you do open up in Firefox, actually Firefox pops it up in its own. And interestingly here, you can, so let's suppose you're running this on your mobile device, right? You can actually set vibration pattern. I'm running on the desktop, so it's not too obvious. And you can set up these things. And the payload is the actual data. In my case, it's that new verb, right? So what you saw here says, hey, new jargon item added by another user. I got a notification, right? So if, sorry. So over here, another important thing is that you cannot directly talk to the UI side and the service worker side. Instead, you depend on messaging to each other. You use, I have here clients. You can send messages. And once you have sent the message, so on the other end of your app, right, I believe it's in the index.js. I'm not sure if it's, I don't think it's here. But anyway, on the client side, on the user's UI side, you can also intercept that message. And then, oh, actually it's here. Okay, navigator, service worker, add event listener. So I send a message from there, and here you can, again, do interesting things, right? You can further propagate the message. So so that's another interesting part. So if you need to send a message to the service worker from the UI side, also you depend on a message. Looks like my battery is running low. That's it. So let me show you one last piece since we're running low on time. So there's a really cool tool called Lighthouse, and the Lighthouse can be used to analyze your progressive web app, okay? And so you can say generate report, and it will run through that, and you will notice it's running the app, right? And then in the end, it will give you a nice report. And you can see the performance is not great, and the SEO is pretty good, right? And if you go down there, it will literally give you recommendations on what to do, right? Hey, you can minify JavaScript. Yeah, that's a good idea. Accessibility. How am I doing with accessibility? And have you implemented best practices, right? No HTTPS, obviously, in this case. And actually, it detects a vulnerability in a jQuery 3.31. You guys probably already know that. And SEO, how friendly is it for search engines to index it, right? So lastly, I mentioned to you, actually I need to go back to the app. So this is I've locally installed one, right? So you can install this even if it's on the desktop. So if you install it, again, it asks the user for permission. If you say install, progressive web app, remember we talked about it should feel like an app. It should be installable. And it gets its own window, right? And on desktop, it doesn't look that great, but on mobile devices, it looks just like an app. And more importantly, on mobile devices, the service workers, they don't sleep even if you close the browser, so that it can receive push notifications even if your browser is not open. And that concludes my presentation. I don't know if we have time for questions or not. Any questions? Yes.
Does the create React app, the bulk service worker, does it do a good job of all the caching and all that?
No, absolutely, that's nothing like that. It says service worker, it's not a service worker at all. It's just a piece of code to go register a service worker if you wish to.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's nothing like how we should do stuff.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, there are really good documentations on, if you go search Google, Google has really good documentations on progressive web app, and Google really is leading the way. But as you can see, the implication of this, right? Once we have progressive web app, where do we develop native apps? Where do we do all these other things? This is going to be very cost efficient for developers and companies who are building apps, and it's going to make sense, and we'll see what happens. Yes.
So there could be native functionality like for push notifications, for rich push notifications. Does it have an ability to interact with like native capabilities that are not like the classic push notification out of the box, as an example?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
You can have rich push notifications.
Okay, Rich.
Yeah, like handlers on the native side for in React Native, where you can now show images or have more complex push notifications.
Oh, yeah.
Is that something?
Absolutely, it can be done. You saw that payload JSON, right? This is just a simple example. You can send anything in the payload, right? It could be, if you're talking about an image, could simply be a URL you're sending in that payload, which in turn, once it's on the browser side, can download that image, right? And you can even have blobs and so on in there. So I don't know if that makes sense to you.
As you're updating the jargon, which route was it that it was going through? Like you were showing the pretty much like if it was going to update the database first, or it was going to go through and check cache, like.
Okay, so right,
online.
so it's hard to see because I'm using workbox. It's kind of hidden inside the workbox, right? So on the in the service worker, browser has built-in cache API and a fetch API, right? And so you can tell it, say, hey, listen to this request, right? And if you're listening to that request, if that route matches from the UI side, browser side, and then it gives you an opportunity to intercept that and at which point you can decide to respond with a local cache content or simply ignore it, right? Just respond with another request using the fetch API going to the server.
You can ignore if you want it to update in there.
I mean, it's your code, right? You can do whatever you want in there. Yeah. All right. Yes.
Kind of a two-part question. One, like the service worker, when you close your app,
Uh,
I assume the service worker stays running at that point, right?
Not on desktops.
Oh, okay, but on like,
Mobile devices, yes.
and then is there like a lifetime for it? Like, would it time out like after an hour or 2 hours?
That I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't think it should time out. It should constantly be running unless the user turns it off, because the point is that it should be expecting push notification at any minute, right? Should be exactly like other apps.
And then I wonder if you like power off your device and power it back on. I assume it doesn't like kick back on then at that point.
I imagine it should. Otherwise, it's not like a, app like experience. So, yes.
Just sort of an extension of that, I would assume that it's the browser itself that's actually maintaining them alive, the service worker alive. So if the browser itself was killed, was shut down, then I would assume that the service worker, or is there
On desktop, that's the case. It goes away.
a case on
According to what I read, it still runs in the background, the service worker.
but a lot of the web browsers run in the background anyway. They stay alive if you don't explicitly kill them.
Right, and
After you exit them, they stay.
yeah, so this is not the same as the browser itself, supposedly. I have not, to be honest, I have not tried it myself on the mobile device, and certainly you can test that out.
That it actually is the browser in a frameless way. Its own window, not
Okay,
but actually is the browser itself running.
okay, it makes sense because service worker runs inside the browser. So yeah, it's some form or another is running in the background. Okay, no question? All right, thanks everyone. All right.
All right. Yeah, thanks for coming out. Feel free to hang out for a few minutes, ask other questions if you want, and see you again. Thanks. A variety of places.
they have ionic at the beginning, now they have capacitor, and they have stencil. Probably won't actually be that. I was at Home Depot about a month ago. I was on a project. The entire UX team is now building everything in stencil. And just today, the beta version 1 got released. But they were already building the components with stencil. Again, because you could deploy to any machine. You could use it with D, you could use it with just any JavaScript. No framework. And what's so cool with stencil though, so check this out. Right now, if you were to build a custom web component, you still have to write this much line of code. It's like JavaScript. That's why we use these Angular wires. That's why we use it. Eventually, you don't have thousands of lines of code to do like two-way binding. You know? Yeah, that's the idea, right? Well, if you were to build a custom web component right now on your own, you're gonna have like for a tiny web component, like click me and I do stuff. You're gonna end up like 50 lines of code. With stencil, 2 lines of code.
Because they have a lot of different stuff.
Yeah, they do that, like of course, like they have to write the logic, right? Someone has to write the logic, so the code has to come from somewhere. But again, so that way you focus on the business logic rather than maintaining the code, thousands of lines of code.
I'm gonna check it out.
Yeah, again, like what's so cool about it, it literally compiles down to the custom web component. The custom web component, as I said, it has its own feature. It even has like a render method. Like, it's like, you would think like this is fucking React. Might as well go to React. What web component, you know? Like, same mindset. It has hooks. It has like element like mounted, unmounted. I swear to God, man. It has methods. You could define a method on it and then call it from outside or not. It's I'm telling you, man.
So obviously, they got a lot of ideas from React.
Huh?
They got a lot of ideas.
Yeah, I swear to God, it's really like a component. Like you send down like an attribute. Like let's say when you do like an href, that href is an attribute. So you could create like your own component with like href or attribute or whatever attribute you want. Well, that's a prop. In React, that's a prop. In web component, they call it an attribute. Well, when you change that attribute, there is actually a hook where you could literally listen to an attribute change and then you could fire it again. I have it. I have it.
State too.
It has,
State and attributes.
I'm telling you, it's unbelievable. Like, might as well just go to the React component. Because you literally can do all that. And that's why it's so powerful. Because you could create a component that will do X, Y, Z.
Well, why is it not seeing as much adoption as
Because it's brand new. Not only that, when you go to look at the specification and how to use it, documentation, dude, doing like any logic, it takes 50 lines of code.
even with stencil?
No, that's 2-3 lines of code. But with a web component, like pure, you say export my class, extend custom element, when it's like Windows and custom element, let's say. Because again, this custom element is built into the Windows. It's in the browser. The browser has to give this API. Otherwise, where are you going to bring it? So anyways, with stencil, it does all that boilerplate. But it's gone like... So you just create a class with an add component decorator, and then you just write JSX. And actually, what's so funny, stencil, when you go to code, is like half Angular, half React. So he borrowed the decorators from Angular, and he borrowed everything else, like the JSX from React. He borrowed the props from the React. You know what I mean? And because he's using JSX now, he doesn't have to come up with a lot of stuff. Because JSX is not just React specific.
Yeah, of course. It's like a
Yeah.
standard thing.
Yeah, it's a library. It's a library on its own. Yeah. So yeah. And it's fairly easy to but again, this is what I think. You wrote 50,000 lines of code. You spend 1 year. Next year you have to rewrite it. Who wants that? So that's why these custom That's crazy. Now check this out. Angular. With Angular 9, very soon, supposed to be releasing a new render called Ivy. Ivy. And what it does, it's kind of similar to what Spot is doing. Instead of shipping down the Angular framework, you're still going to ship down some code. But you're not going to be shipping down the library. You're going to be shipping down the instructions. You're going to you're going to give the browser instructions on how to do stuff. Instructions on how to render an Angular component. I don't know. I have to reread it again. It's been a year since I read it. Like, oh, this is kind of.
Actually, I'm surprised that you're one of the few people who uses React for day job and then Angular is personal. Usually it's the other way around. Like people in like big companies use Angular and then for personal. It's actually interesting.
Yeah. And it's fun, man. Honestly, I like it a lot, Angular, it is very opinionated. You know, I do forget sometimes, like, shoot, how do I do a pipe? I have to go look back at the pipe. I have to, like, refer back because it's huge. Documentation is huge. You know, everything is man-made. Where with React, everything is JavaScript. You know, there's only like 10% React. With Angular, it's literally.
The API separate area is
Yeah, you know, Angular, man, it's 80% Angular, 10% JavaScript, for God's sake. Like, you don't do a for loop yourself. There is an G if, you know, there is ng4, you know, there is ng show, all these things. So that's like the things you could be writing in JavaScript, right? So they already have it. Yeah. And honestly, let me tell you, I do think Angular is better for a big application than React. I'll tell you why. Because there's only one way to do the work. The React, you could go bazillion ways. You have a team, Angular pays off. Angular pays off bigly. Because there is no, you following a certain structure, I follow one. So that means I could go look what you did, you could come look what I did. We could collaborate very fast. That's why it's very fast. And honestly, I mean, once you pay that initial cost of learning startup, and I feel like that's, yeah, no, thank you. I mean, because I had a day job too. I used to work for AMD, and I started doing this like on the side, and then then I quit my job and like focused on this on the business. So to me, like it's interesting when people are working are doing startup. To me. Yeah, yeah, no, no, thank you. Yeah. Let's see, man. But yeah, but I don't want it to be either secret or anything. No, there is no secret, bro. Once I go live, fucking the whole world is gonna know what's secret. Yeah. You know. But it's cool. It's yeah, yeah, thank you. So let's see, man. You know, but yeah, no, honestly, like Swell, yes, guys, published version 3. One of the Udemy instructors, Maximilian, I don't know his name. Like he's from Germany, I think. He just released a